This is Duke University.
Postcolonialism today presents us with a seemingly intractable problematic, and whose main terms are, to my mind, ultimately tied to questions of narrative. For the question postcolonialism persistently presents us with relates to the ways in which the post-colony incites narration that is firmly tied to modes of methodological nationalism. The key assumption behind methodological nationalism is that the nation state is the exclusive container of social processes. The nation state is foregrounded as the unit for studying all major social, economic, and political processes, with the governing idea being the congruence between political, cultural, and social borders that are encapsulated primarily in the nation state form. There have been many critiques of this assumption in the social sciences, especially, ranging from scholars as varied as Ulrich Beck. Some of these names are well known, especially in migration studies. Andreas Wimmer and Nina Gleck-Schiller and Penina Webner, among many others. At the same time, we might also note from a postcolonial studies perspective that methodological nationalism couples a certain anxiety of belatedness to a utopian desire for transcendence, as it reflects upon the shape of the postcolonial nation state being the product of empire, colonialism, and their neo-colonial afterlives. And these afterlives are manifested in a compromised political leadership, the famous kleptocracies of Africa, which my friend Achille has written about very forcefully. Various ethnocultural diasporas that have emerged from the nation state form. And even though the term postcolonialism bears an implicit temporality embedded in it, it is now conveniently agreed that the term is not simply reducible to the period after the colonial, but that postcolonialism names an orientation and critical tendency that precedes the dismantling of colonialism proper and still continues. Furthermore, ever since I completed editing the 2-volume Cambridge History of Postcolonial Literature, which Ian referred to, I have come to see the value of linking Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Latin America in a broader conversation about comparative postcolonialisms, and of seeing postcolonial history as essentially marked by various forms of space making. And I've written on this somewhere. Thus, the many dates that are taken to be central to the field are actually markers of space making. So each historical epoch-making date is actually the signifier, the siglum of space-making. Thus, the many dates that are central, taken to be central to the field, I'm just naming some of them, such as 1492, Columbus's arrival in America and the expulsion of Jews from Spain. 1603, the colonization of the northern counties of Ireland. 1798 to 1801, Napoleon's Egyptian campaign. 1791 to 1804, the Haitian Revolution. And several others, including the 1847 independence of India and partition, and then moving forward to 1994, the end of apartheid. All these must be taken as chronotopes of space making. Tomorrow I'll spend quite a bit of time elaborating what I understand by chronotopes, drawn of course from Mikhail Bakhtin. To understand the significance of space making to the entire spectrum of the postcolonial world, however, requires us to engage afresh, as I mentioned earlier, with the decolonization histories, because decolonization is central to postcolonial space making. And yet the decolonization histories of the various regions that I've mentioned, Africa, South Asia, Latin America, have produced completely different consequences for each post-colony. So the decolonization of Latin America, which of course takes place at by the first 25 years of the 19th century, they've all been decolonized. They've wrested the country, various nation states from Spain and Portugal. The decolonization of Africa takes place from late 50s to the mid 60s. They're all decolonized. But the processes, it's worthwhile comparing them because the processes have had consequences for the space making and the contradictions that we find today. The problematic of postcolonial literature, however, this time I'm going to moving away from postcolonial studies to literature proper, is that the early inflections of postcolonial writing were firmly linked to demonstrating that the postcolonial nation state was what provided this template of resistance to empire. So the postcolonial nation state, so the postcolonial literature then becomes a way of not just celebrating, but defining the terms of that template. The privileging of this template then also is tied to another more surreptitious trope, and which is the trope of epocality, of the before and after of independence, for organizing what are the meanings of identity and identification in the post-colony. And so we find that this trope of epocality allows us to very readily interpret the nation and narration type of post-colonial writing, which is exemplified in many, many writers: Wole Soyinka, Chinua Achebe, Ngugi Raja Rao, Yvonne Vera, many, even Gabriel Garcia Marquez and Isabel Allende are among these nation and narration type, I would argue. Epocality also provides a channel of narrative, or a channel for narrative and creative experimentation, best exemplified, in my view, in the work of Salman Rushdie. For Rushdie, there's a fundamental sense in which the nation state provides or offers him the conduit for thinking through borders, barriers, epocality, so not just epoch, but epocalities and so on. So that for him, epocality is performative. And so we see, for example, in the oscillation in Rushdie's work between the repeated affirmations of epocality and its real and threatened dissolution, allows us to read him simultaneously as the exemplary griot, not just of the Indian condition, but also as a diasporic writer par excellence. The paradox that Rushdie illustrates is that while elaborating a complex diasporic and transnational aesthetic, and postmodernist aesthetic also, we must add, in the course of his career, he has also firmly maintained a long-standing interest in moments of epocality as a creative impulse for his best writing. Whether this was in the birth of India in Midnight's Children, what more epochal text than that, or Pakistan in Shame, or of Islam in the Satanic Verses. However, after the infamous fatwa of 1989, Rushdie turns decisively away from the trope of the epochal, nation-state inflected, literary form. And I think he loses his way so that the ground beneath her feet, in my humble view, is unreadable. As is Fury and the ground beneath her feet, I don't know what he was doing there. And I think that it's the retreat from epocality which is enforced by the fatwa. He retreats from it. It is only much later, or more recently, that he returns to a form of yarn spinning, storytelling, because he's a great spinner of yarns. He returns to the yarn spinning, which he first experiments with in Harun and the Sea of Stories, one of my favorite Rushdie novels. He returns to the modality of Harun, which is non-epochal, by the way, in the more recent Luca and the Fire of Life and the Enchantress of Florence. But none of these exhibit the concern with epocality. So basically, even in Rushdie's long oeuvre, we see the performative value of the nation-state form articulated as a trope of epocality. Now, if I have attended so far to the first term of my title, the postcolonial, it's time to turn to our attention to diasporas in the Diasporic Imaginary. As Daniel Barber suggests in a really beautiful theological treatise that was published about 2 years ago, a central dialectic of the diasporic condition is that between integrity and spatial discontinuity. Integrity and spatial discontinuity. From the early Greek etymological roots of the term diaspora, which simply put means scattering over, through the various categories of diasporization provided by Cohen, Dufour, Schaeffer, and various others, diasporas have always implied a shifting set of relationships between different spaces and distances. Subjectivity is no longer tied exclusively to the immediacy of present location, whether it be the nation state or the land of sojourn, but rather extends to encompass all the other places of co-ethnic identification. And diasporic forms of social relations are especially intensified in the era of the internet and of social networking. Something happens to a co-ethnic in one part of the world, and this is immediately put on Facebook or tweeted or placed on an email list to ensure that other co-ethnics may know and relate to what has happened in a distant place. The increased interrelationality of social spaces in today's world is accounted for in the social sciences by the now widespread terminology of transnationalism, such as transnational circuits, networks, social fields, and social space. These are all terms that are central to transnational studies, except that there is a faulty similitude assumed between transnationalism and diasporas. And I think I should just clarify quickly. Transnational groups or societies or communities are defined by the absence of co-ethnic identification. So gays in America may take up arms on behalf of gays in Uganda, but it is not because there's co-ethnic identification. It is issue-driven, issue-based identification, the same with environmentalists all over the world. But the co-ethnic, the absence of co-ethnic identification actually makes the bonds of transnational communities, which are not diasporic communities, somewhat porous, because the gays in America are more concerned with the constitution of American life. So ultimately, when push comes to shove, they will, if not necessarily abandon, but retreat from the identification with places else, which happens all the time. Whereas the co-ethnic identification, which is central to diasporas, ensures that if, for example, Jews are under attack in Austria, which has happened in the past, the Jews in Toronto will pay attention. And they will pay attention until, because the attack on Jews or Ghanaians or Nigerians in Sydney or wherever it is an attack on Ghanaians or Nigerians or Jews everywhere. Within the diasporic imaginary, now within the let me spend a bit of time. This is important because it's what I'm coming to do now is to provide a very, very quick snapshot of different types of diasporas. And this is important because it becomes methodologically salient when we are talking about, we're differentiating between postcolonial and diasporic texts. So there are different types of diasporas. The default diasporas are what are called the victim diasporas, the Jewish, African American, Armenian diasporas. And the victim diasporas are defined by genocide, an attempt by either an invading power or a different political group to destroy a perceived cultural threat. But this genocide is then coupled to an interdiction against return. So if you are chased out of your country but you can return, you are not you're a refugee, you are not a diasporic. In fact, this difference is fundamental to Palestinians refusing the term diaspora. So the Palestinians will always style themselves Palestinians in exile, even if they've been in exile for 30 years, they still say they are refugees. Of course, there's all kinds of international protocols that insist on keeping them as refugees as opposed to diaspora. But at any rate, the distinctive features of victim diasporas are that there is a victimization, violence, coupled to an interdiction against return. The second major type of the diaspora category are labor diasporas, what in common parlance we would call economic migrants. These are, and historically, these labor diasporas have been constituted as an instrument of empire. So, for example, the Indians of East Africa, or the Indians of the indentured labor period, so shortly after independence, shortly after the abolition of slavery, the plantation owners, they just go crazy. They want either a financial remuneration or replacement of the labor that has been lost. The British Parliament sets up the policy of indentured labor, which gets various laborers from China also and India transferred to the Caribbean and to East Africa. So the labor diasporas are not the same as victim diasporas. The other thing that I should mention is that some of these categories often overlap. So the African American diaspora is both a labor and a victim diaspora at the same time. The third type, central key diaspora, is the trade diasporas. Trade diasporas is exactly, it says exactly what it does. It does exactly what it says on the tin, and which is merchants, but going as a collective to various places to trade and then establishing a community. Now, any Chinatown that you enter today is actually a trade diaspora. All Chinatowns, wherever you find them, whether in San Francisco, in New York, they are trade diasporas. Except that trade diasporas are also fascinatingly entangled with labor diasporas. So that Chinatowns are also very well known in the literature as being, connected to human trafficking, labor trafficking of their co-ethnics. So the co-ethnics are trafficked, they become labor migrants or labor diasporas, but encapsulated or captured within a trade diaspora. The final type of diaspora to mention are imperial diasporas. Now this is controversial because they may have started off as imperial diasporas, but they were quickly converted into settler colonists. There's a Tannenhaus. Leonard Tannenhaus has written a really fascinating book called The Importance of Feeling English, in which he argues that the post-Civil War American culture, and he's thinking mainly of the East Coast, was really a diasporic culture. The anxieties regarding the relations with the metropolitan civility, dress, forms of democracy, ideals about democracy and so on, they find them as bearing diasporic anxieties. And yet the difference between them and, say, today's Somali Americans is that those imperial diasporas came with the primary purpose of expropriating land and turning the natives into manure. No Somali will come and say, I'm taking your land and turning you into manure. So they say, so the imperial diaspora category is problematic, except that in the early phases, you can see overlaps and features similar to diasporas of today. So in Australian literature, the early Australian literature bears all the markings and features of the diaspora writing that we find today. All the typology of elements and types that I have just laid out can be elaborated under pressure in a variety of different directions. But what I have been interested in over the past 3 or so years is in finding a way to draw up a distinction between postcolonial literature and the diasporic imaginary. At the most formulaic and perhaps even banal level, I want to suggest that postcolonial literature is marked by a nostalgia for lost time, lost temporalities, lost time, while the diasporic imaginary is marked by a nostalgia for lost space. To understand the implication of this somewhat basic distinction, however, we are obliged to pay special attention to the key features of the diasporic imaginary, which I propose are the interrelated elements of place, nostalgia, and genealogical accountings. Now, of the three, place and nostalgia overlap with postcolonialism, while genealogical accountings, I suggest, is absolutely definitive for the diasporic imaginary. There's no diasporic piece of writing that does not display a sense of what I'm going to elaborate in a moment, genealogical accountings. Now, there's a story that I picked from a Hasidic story that I heard from one of my Jewish friends, which helps to pin this down somewhat. A 4-year-old boy is insisting to his parents that he wants to have a word with his 6-month-old sister by himself. And the parents are somewhat baffled, indeed scared. What's wrong with this kid? They try to prevent him, he's insistent. So one day they let him into his sister's crib and they eavesdrop. And the boy, 4-year-old, bends toward his sister and whispers, but loud enough for them to hear, "I want you to tell me where we came from because I'm beginning to forget." Say, "I want you to tell me where we came from because I'm beginning to forget." Now, what I define as genealogical accountings have to be distinguished from genealogies. It's not the same. Genealogical accountings entail stories of how we got here. But how we got here, so stories of how we got here, which reflect upon the means of locomotion as much as the process of arrival. And the means of locomotion include, when I say means of locomotion, trains. So trains are central to Jewish storytelling in the 20th century. Or ships. Ships have been central to the old Indian indentured labor diasporas of the 19th century. The means of locomotion and the means of traversal are central to genealogical accountings. The other thing about genealogical accountings is that they are used to convey a sense of distinction between the diasporic community and the people of the sojourning lands. And the reason is that the genealogical accounting is also to provide a kind of ethical distinctiveness. We suffered. Sometimes individuals use this all the time. Your kid, I've done it before, comes in. My 12-year-old kid, he says he wants the same iPhone that I have. What the hell is wrong with you? Do you know how I got here before I got this iPhone? You have no idea. The point, though, is that the stories about how we got here have to be connected to the means of spatial traversal. This is really important. So it's quite different from genealogies of who we are. This is who we are, but it involves the processes of becoming through particular kinds of dispersal. Now, there are a variety of genealogical genres of genealogical accounting. So we do have the train stories of the Jewish famous train stories, and we know how important trains were for the Jewish for Jewish spatial traversal. We also have the trains, the ship stories I've mentioned already. We also have what I want to call disembarkation stories. Ellis Island, all Ellis Island stories are disembarkation stories. The stories of when we arrived, how they changed, because they couldn't pronounce my name, they changed it to Winter. I have this a professor of history at Yale, who, I forget what his name was, but the guy who was entering them couldn't pronounce it. Says, from now you are Winter. That's how, so he's become J. Winter, the famous historian at Yale. This happens all the time. They could not pronounce our names. So all the stories of disembarkation stories are ultimately genealogical accounting tales. And in fact, they are circulated in the community as a means for them not to ever forget that you arrived from somewhere else. The second genre of genealogical accountings involves what I call visa stories. Now, I cannot tell you the number of different diasporic communities that keep a reservoir of visa stories. There was one that I heard from a Pakistani friend of mine in the queue up for the American visa. A Sikh man and his family had to stay in the line, in the queue for upwards of a week. So they brought their whole kitchen. And the man and the woman would take turns to cook. And this is a fantastic feat. In fact, in this woman's novel, Kiran Desai, Inheritance of Loss, she has a fascinating visa story of how the main character who goes to work in kitchens in New York, how he tells fibs, very fast. The entire village is interested in what is going to happen to him. And he has to tell a series of very clever stories to get his visa. Visa stories are a fundamental genre within genealogical accountings. The other genre in genealogical accountings is how I got my so how I got my visa is different from this second. It's related but it's different. It's how I got my resident permit, my papers. In fact, the Americans have a most ridiculous category of what they call undocumented alien. And the last thing you want to do when they declare you undocumented is to remain undocumented. So this actually generates lots of story. In fact, there are among them in the Latino, Hispanic community, there are even songs about how to procure your green card stories of the green card. But the point is that it's more complex than just getting a green card, because the stories entail very detailed descriptions of interactions with the bureaucratic state apparatus, and what you must know and not know, and do and not do, and what you have to say and not say, and so on. And these stories, the point of them is that they are circulated within the community as a memory bank, a reservoir both of the know-how of how to get your papers, and also a reminder that you're actually not from here. Now, so far, I've given the impression that genealogical accountings are all positive, or their effects are positive. But that's not true. Because what happens is that in certain instances, the genealogical accountings also become or are converted into a justification for speech acts and the hierarchy. I suffered, therefore I am. And therefore, if you didn't suffer as I did, you dare not either criticize me or my community, or indeed, or criticize, yes, you can't criticize me or my community, or to criticize my story is to also obliterate my right to exist, my right to live. So it's also, it converts itself into exclusionary speech acts. So that ultimately, one of the effects of genealogical accountings can also sadly be an atomization, because we would expect diasporics, if they all share these genres and types, we would expect there to be more political amity among, but that's not the case. That's not the case at all. Sometimes also we must admit that the various genealogical accountings are also tied to the homelands. And if there's political contradictions or conflict between or rivalries, between the homelands, the genealogical accountings are also in a way feed into raise a distinction between where you came from and where. So it cannot be that your suffering may be as bad as mine, but where you came from is not as good as where I came from. And you find so that the genealogical accountings are not all positive.
Produced by Duke University, online at duke.edu.